Welcome everyone to the panel. It's entitled Island Geothermal, an Untapped Resource. Now, this panel will focus on the geothermal development of small islands in the Eastern Caribbean. As you may or may not know, these islands are part of a volcanic island arc. And by their very nature, the topography is absolutely beautiful, but definitely challenging when it comes to renewable energy development. But with that topography comes geothermal resources, which if tapped, can reshape the electricity system in the island. And all of my esteemed panelists today are part of the Clinton Climate Initiative Women in Renewable Energy Network. And the aim of this network is to bring women in the Caribbean together to share lessons and discuss ideas relating to renewable energy. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing in this panel today. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce my esteemed panelists, and we'll start with Ms. Charlene Bodley. Charlene, you're on mute.
Good afternoon, all. So that was a dry run. I am Charlene Bodley from the CCRE. I am the Sustainable Energy Project Development and Gender Expert of the CCRE. I have also served as the Women in Renewable Energy Program Manager, part-time Program Manager, and I am the founder of the Women in Geothermal Caribbean Chapter, launched in March of this year, 2019, in Guadeloupe. I am also a very proud member of the Women in Renewable Energy Network.
Thank you, Charlene. I'll hand over to Elise.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elise Dalton. I'm the company secretary and the legal officer at Dominica Electricity Services Limited. In my role, I provide legal support and oversight for all the major projects of the company, and the geothermal project that the government of Dominica is presently involved in is one of such projects, because under that project, Dominic is the off-taker. Also a proud member recently of the Women in Renewable Energy group, organized by the CCI.
Thank you, Elise. Now I want to hand over to Judith, but I just want to make a keynote here that Judith is here from the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States, which is the lead partner in organizing the Virtual Island Summit. And they were key in organizing many of the panels. So firstly, congratulations and thank you to Judith for her key role in the entire summit, but I'll hand it over to her to introduce herself.
Thank you, Sienna. Good afternoon, good day to colleagues wherever you are joining us. As she said, my name is Judith Ephraim and I am the Program Coordinator of the Sustainable Energy Unit at the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States Commission, the OECS. And we are very pleased to be part of this esteemed panel this afternoon to discuss geothermal energy. Just by way of introduction, the OECS Commission, well, the OECS is an intergovernmental grouping in the Eastern Caribbean that was established to promote cooperation amongst its 11 member states at the regional and international levels. The OECS has adopted a common approach to a number of key policy and developmental areas, including energy, and so we see geothermal energy as being a very big part of our mandate.
Thank you, Judith. I would like to hand it over to James to issue a poll now. I see there are quite a number of attendees, so welcome all attendees. But we would really like to understand, where do you consider home? So I'll just be quiet for 30 seconds while you answer the question. You should see something pop up on your screen. Okay, so the results are shared. So 48% of you come from the Caribbean. Wonderful, welcome. The next biggest group comes from North America, and we have attendees from the Pacific and Australasia, Europe, and East Asia. So welcome all of you, and I hope you enjoy and you learn a lot from this. And I believe there's another question. James, would you like to ask that as well? So the question is, which sector best describes you? So take 30 seconds and please answer this. Okay, great. So we have a broad audience here, 9% from academia, 28% from the private sector, 13% from the public sector, no one from the utility company, unfortunately, 25% from NGOs, 3%, none, 22% other. Thank you so much for answering the question. So for our global audience coming from as far as East Asia, I'd like to hand it over to Judith. And Judith, can you paint a picture of the Caribbean island landscape for us?
Okay, thank you, Sienna. And again, a special welcome to the colleagues joining us from across the globe. I'm gonna present it in the context of geothermal energy and with a focus on the Eastern Caribbean, because this is where really most of our geothermal resources are located. So if you look at the islands along the chain, these islands are fairly small islands if we look at them compared to even some of the other islands in the Caribbean. And so geothermal energy holds a special place for them in terms of the ability to transform their national energy landscape, so to speak. I just want to show you a map of the Yes, I just wanted to show you a map of the OECS. As I indicated, the concentration is on the OECS, but we do recognize that there are other islands who are not part of the OECS, such as some of the Dutch islands, who also have an interest in geothermal energy. So if we look, we are starting at the British Virgin Islands, going down to Grenada, and I've highlighted some of the interesting figures pertaining to potential or planned capacity for geothermal energy. And we have St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Grenada. This next slide really shows you the figures that we are looking at. Guadeloupe is currently the only member of the OECS that has an existing geothermal plant of 15 megawatt capacity, but they have some plans for expansion up to 32 megawatts. And we see the figures now ranging from Dominica with 7 megawatts, and they are pretty advanced in terms of their geothermal planning. And we have others like Grenada, 15 megawatts, Montserrat, 2.5 to 3.5 megawatts. And one may wonder why such small figures. But if you look at the actual installed capacity on those islands and their demand, their peak load, you would understand that despite those numbers being very small, they are very important for this part of the world. So this is currently what geothermal energy looks like in the OECS. We have some pictures of some drilling. If you actually look at the historical record, geothermal energy exploration has been going on for quite some time, but there has been really an increase in activity and political will for geothermal energy in the, I would say, the past 5 years, which really signals a very positive move for the region. So in terms of the actual features of energy in the Caribbean, And again, with a focus on the Eastern Caribbean, but this would also be similar for most other parts of the wider Caribbean. We are primarily gross importers of fossil fuels, apart from countries such as Trinidad and Tobago. And as a result, the cost of energy can be comparatively high and accounts for a high percentage of our GDP. You would imagine that that affects, for instance, our competitiveness and our ability to broaden and grow in some areas of production. Transportation and tourism, these are the sectors with the largest, which are the largest consumers of energy. Again, like I said, this really affects our economic growth. So if there was one way that we could get to reduce our electricity prices, especially, that would help us to become more competitive and to improve the quality of life for our citizens. We do have good potential for renewable energy. We have some potential for solar, and that has been growing in the past recent years. Wind is also a strong contender. There have been some hydro, but this is limited to some islands, and there's of course some scope for biomass. So what are the drivers for geothermal energy? Really, it's really about reducing the region's dependence on imports and oil products for electricity generation, and also stabilizing and reducing the electricity prices. And this would really contribute to the region's energy security and help to attract investment and grow the economy. The provision of a predictable energy cost is really one of the added values of geothermal, and we see a very strong commitment on the parts of government to achieve this. Geothermal energy, although it has been a bit of a challenge in terms of the time, the amount of time it has taken, and the investments that are required, when we compare to the other renewable energy sources that are in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Caribbean, it has some very distinct advantages, which makes it a very attractive option for us. It has a distinction of having high availability, and that can be delivered 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And you have this really, the plants are able to operate continuously at capacities that are very high, and so you have little downtime for maintenance. So this provides base load, which is an important factor for small islands. You would appreciate that renewable energy sources such as wind and solar do present some intermittency problems. And for islands who do not have the capability, the financial and technical capability to address some of the issues of grid stability, this is actually quite a very attractive option. There are opportunities for both electricity generation and direct use. And in addition, because our islands have such small sizes, so to speak, land is very important. So the small footprint of geothermal is another added advantage that is particularly important to us in the Eastern Caribbean. If you look to the right of the slide, you will see a diagram which shows you, which compares the different renewable energy sources. And as you can see, geothermal energy has the smallest footprint and makes it very attractive. It is also modular, which means that the investments can be expanded. And although the geothermal projects are relatively capital intensive, because they have low and predictable operating costs, they would augur well for our economies. And there's the whole issue of resilience that has become very important in light of the passage of several hurricanes, well, not several, but 3 major hurricanes over the past, I would say, 4 years. It has really underscored the need for us to build resilience in our electricity sector. And we understand that geothermal energy would be a little less vulnerable to the impacts of wind and hurricanes. In terms of prices, this really is just a schematic showing you how geothermal compares with some of the other renewable energy prices. This is actually a figure that was produced by Castelia in 2017. And it shows you that geothermal energy is actually quite competitive at that time based on this analysis compared to some of the solar and wind projects that were being developed or pursued rather for the Caribbean. So I would like to stop here, but just to make the point that geothermal energy really has the largest potential to transform the landscapes in terms of energy for the Eastern Caribbean. It provides an opportunity for energy independence and also energy interdependence, because one of the areas that is being pursued by the countries is the ability to sell or export geothermal energy if it becomes successful.
Thank you very much, Judith. Charlene, given that you're from St. Lucia, but you work in Barbados now and you also have a view of the entire Caribbean, do you have anything to add?
Okay, and once again, to listeners and viewers from across the world who have joined us, welcome. It is such a pleasure to be here. From the St. Lucia standpoint, I mean, Judith mentioned these islands in the Eastern Caribbean having these long histories. St. Lucia is perhaps notorious where geothermal energy is concerned, with exploration efforts dating as far back as 1951. But what to me remains, so fascinating about geothermal energy in the Caribbean, one would ask, if so, then why continue these efforts? And I think Judith has sufficiently answered these questions. Our islands at this point, I mean, resilience means something completely different for Caribbean islands as it did, I would say, 10 years ago. With the passing now of these frequent Category 5 hurricanes, we have reached that point where it is critical that we rethink our efforts at achieving sustainable energy. And for some of these islands, geothermal energy is one of the answers. In the St. Lucia context, a small island plagued by very high prices of electricity that undermine our economic competitiveness. And again, remember, St. Lucia is an island that is dependent on tourism for its economic growth. Having or developing geothermal energy in St. Lucia could significantly change not only the energy landscape, but by extension, the economic landscape. And so St. Lucia continues in its efforts. The other thing I may add that in the region, what has happened of late that has assisted the development of geothermal is the assistance of development partners, development banks, and being creative in coming up with models that work for our small economies. One may ask, in the case of Dominica, I mean, we saw that graph that Judith had on screen, the capacity of the geothermal plants that are being pursued. One may ask, why do we even bother? In Dominica is looking at putting up a 7 megawatt plant. And that makes it very difficult in terms of attracting the very best developers. And you could think of so many other disadvantages that our small economies face trying to develop these very small capacities of geothermal. But I think the benefits far outweigh the difficulties that we face while we develop these resources. In the case of St. Lucia stands to single-handedly from geothermal achieve a share of renewable energy of over 60%. And in terms of fuel cost savings and the amount of money that leaves the country for the purchase of imported fossil fuels, and not to mention meeting our NDC targets, national targets, and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, geothermal definitely is a top runner where the sustainable energy landscape and program is concerned for the Eastern Caribbean states.
Thank you, Charlene. I'll just take a quick pause here. I see some questions are coming in. So for the attendee, please submit your question through the Q&A button that you have there. And there'll be time at the end for your question to be answered. Okay, so we've heard from Charlene and Judith that there are tremendous opportunities for geothermal to positively impact the Caribbean islands. But there are so many moving parts when it comes to geothermal development. And those moving parts can be amplified in the small island setting. And Dominica has made tremendous progress towards their geothermal development. So I'd like to hand it over to Elise Dalton, And given that there are so many challenges, so many opportunities, but also so many challenges, can you speak to that a bit, Elise?
Thank you, Sayana. Welcome to all the attendees at this session. I'm not sure if the profile has changed, but I seem to be the only person representing the utility company here. And it's a good opportunity for me to share a different perspective or an additional perspective, because there's so many perspectives to the whole project, geothermal development project. As Judith would have explained earlier, I think she gave a very concise snapshot of the OACS islands in terms of their size and as well as their energy demand. And Dominica is no exception. Though we are the largest of the English-speaking Windward Islands, in terms of population size, we have perhaps the smallest or among the smallest. Our population is about 70,000 last census. And on island, our peak demand is 15 megawatts, and it recently approached 15 megawatts. Prior to the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria in 2018, our peak demand was 18 megawatts. So having, as Charlene mentioned before, the development of a 7 megawatt geothermal plant on Dominica is of great significance and impact to the transformation of the energy sector on the island. And we are perhaps at the most advanced stage in the development of a geothermal project. Our customer base is small. Prior to the hurricane, we had 36,000. We're about 85% back up to those numbers. So the ability to transform that energy market lies in geothermal for all the reasons that Judith quite eloquently stated earlier on. And it has been, or geothermal development, or the prospect for geothermal development has been a burning issue from the policy directive of the government for quite a while now. Just as in St. Lucia, as far back as in the 1970s, geothermal development was a major political strategy, political initiative. Legislation was passed, a geothermal development company was established, all aimed at developing the resource. And over the years, several attempts have been made to progress that initiative. In the 1990s, a development license was issued to a private developer, and a power purchase agreement was executed with the utility company, being Domlec. It was a 10-year license, and nothing or not much happened. It ended up in some litigation when Domlec attempted to terminate the contract. But eventually the license expired by a fraction of time, and that went on the wayside. And then there was about 2004, 2005, or 2003, there was a regional initiative undertaken by the OAS. It was the Geothermal project, which attempted to again link certain identified islands in the OACS and discuss technical assistance, financial assistance, and legal and regulatory assistance to help develop the resource among those islands. And that project yielded quite a few benefits, because out of it, certain legislation was developed, at least in Dominica, and all the islands benefited from scientific research on the geothermal potential that existed on the islands that were the subject of the study. But unfortunately, nothing materialized out of that project as well. But the government of Dominica remained interested in developing the resource. And again, because of the several benefits that geothermal has in terms of its prospects for small economies like ours. As a matter of fact, at the end of the Geothermal project, it was identified that the island of Dominica had the greatest potential. It has been speculated as up to 50 megawatts, so 100 megawatts, so that coming out of that project, the scientific findings gave a further impetus to the government to develop that resource. As a matter of fact, part of the government's plan is not only the development of the local power plant for servicing the local needs, but also to explore the possibility of export to the neighboring French territories. Although Guadeloupe has the Bouillante plant, they are also looking to expand on the green and renewable energy available to them. And they have always maintained an interest in tapping whatever resources available in Dominica. And discussions began with the government of Dominica and several French agencies. And there were 2 attempts at forming some sort of consortium and partnership to develop the resource with the French, between the French and Dominica. These, for whatever reasons, and we can go into that in a little more detail, these did not eventually materialize. The last of them having fallen apart in about 2015. So that there were these attempts made when eventually the government decided to embark on the project through a private company wholly owned by the government, but which would initiate the development of the resource and for sale of the electricity to Domlec, which is the private utility. So that what we see is that the potential is there. Dominica is very volcanic, very mountainous. There are springs, sulfur springs, there's a boiling lake. So the topography of the island and its geological makeup, and from the scientific studies that have done, have established that we have a great resource on which we sit. And when you couple that with all the benefits that Judith and Charlene have identified in terms of the benefit to a small island developing state of the ability to develop that resource, a 7 megawatt plant makes a big difference in an energy sector where the peak demand is 15 megawatts. But the challenge has been and continues to be, at least it was for us, as I would have explained over the years, is finding that right strategic partner and finding the partnership that works and is maintained. And that was a challenge, one of the main challenges for the development of the resource over the decades that we've been trying at it in Dominica. It eventually came through when the government developed a private company, but owned by the government, which put it in a position where it could access financing that was available for the public sector, as well as financing that would be available for the private sector. And that is the funding that, sorry about that, that's my energy saving lighting arrangements kicking into action, sorry about that. So eventually that the project was structured in that way. And through that project structure, the government was able to address another significant challenge to geothermal development, which is financing. We know that geothermal projects are very expensive to develop, particularly at the exploration and drilling stages. We know that tens of thousands of millions of US dollars or even EU dollars are required to make that investment. And that has also been a challenge. But because of the way the project was structured, the government has been able to source funding from the IDA, from SIDS-DOC, from Clean Technology Fund, and several other international development agencies and development banks that were able to provide the financing, that were able to have progress, the research and development, the drilling and the testing, and the development of the geothermal development company. And we're at the stage now where we have kind of sorted out a PPA agreement, setting out the provisions on which we would engage in buying power from the development company for sale to our customers. So that the journey has been long. We've had these challenges, as I said, of structuring the deal. How do you get this project going? What strategic partners and alliances you can make to have the project developed? What is the financing that would be available to get the project moving forward? Always conscious of the fact that these are small projects on small islands and economies of scale are not always in your favor. but we have arrived thus far and sort of managed that, that challenge.
Thank you, Elise. It sounds like Dominica doesn't just have a great record. Dominica has an excellent record. And because of that, everyone wants to be involved. And that meant that not just like the local Dominican had to build up expertise. You're a lawyer, they're a utility engineer here, government had to build up expertise to be able to decide on the right partnership for you and your country. And that's a really remarkable story. Thanks for sharing. And as the only utility rep here, I mean, I think utility has a big role to play, government has a big role to play, but another key stakeholder is the community. And I want to hear a bit more about the people, the community, and not just the social aspect, but the environmental aspect. Charlene, do you have anything to share in that regard?
Sure, Sienna. And before I go into the community, I want to just broadly speak about the stakeholders that have been instrumental in the success that the region has experienced so far. And kudos to our international development partners, the World Bank, CDB with its GeoSmart initiative. And I'm happy that we realized at the time that we did that geothermal energy required a special approach, an approach that would tackle the issue of risk. And this is, I mean, when you speak of geothermal and we speak of the disadvantages, the challenges, the difficulties that we face, one of these difficulties is the fact that these projects are capital intensive, extremely risky at the upstream development stages, because you may or may not find that you have a commercially viable resource. And small economies like ours in the Caribbean, simply cannot take on the cost and the risk associated with developing a geothermal resource, from exploration to putting up a power plant and absorbing all of that risk. And so we've had agencies like the World Bank coming along and assisting islands such as St. Lucia. In St. Vincent, we have the CDB assisting also. And islands have had to become very creative in developing business models that work for our context. And so the use of public financing at the upstream development stages to de-risk the project, and then bringing in private developers at the downstream development stages of the project, have been instrumental in ensuring that geothermal energy for electricity generation produces a price that is competitive with solar and wind. And I'm saying that because that now links to stakeholders. There is sometimes the misconception among our people that geothermal energy is so capital intensive and that governments of the islands are wasting resources in trying to develop these resources. But as I said, with the SMAP model and with our islands being creative, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, took the approach of having a PPP arrangement. And so all of these very creative means have led to us securing lower prices of electricity from geothermal energy. So that's on one end. On the end of determining or ensuring that stakeholders are happy, so to speak, with geothermal development, that is not always clear-cut. And I believe that as projects are developed and designed and executed, for me it has been one of my major learning points that including a proper stakeholder engagement plan is very important to the success of geothermal projects. And this is not unique to the region. In France, there have been cases where geothermal projects have been abandoned because it did not get the level of support and acceptance necessary to have these projects follow through. So communities were unhappy. There was that that attitude of not in my backyard. And in the islands, as Judith mentioned, the footprint, and that is very important to our context, as we have competing uses of land. And so as we develop these projects, stakeholders, so community members, government officials, utilities, regulators, developers, everyone has to be brought to the table for the essential conversations. And having stakeholder engagements should not happen as a means of disseminating information after a project is designed or is in the middle of its execution. I'm not sure if Elise can also share with us some of the experience of Dominica in that regard, but the entire environmental social impact assessment process has proven to be so essential to garnering that support and contributing to the success of geothermal projects. And one important point to note is that none of our islands at this point have the legislation in place to fully support geothermal energy, although St. Vincent and perhaps Dominica may be ahead of the game in that regard. But that complete suite of legislation and regulations, including ESIA, Environmental Social Impact Assessment processes and strategies that must be adopted, have still not been fully developed in our islands. However, I know for the case of St. Lucia, I can say that because we were supported by the World Bank, and as was the desire of the government of St. Lucia to ensure that this was really a project for the people, by the people, the ESIA process was a process that really had high importance to the island. And it surely did improve the level of acceptance at the political level, at the community level. And I mean, putting up a geothermal power plant that, and you know, when we speak of the lifetime of a geothermal power plant, I always ask, can anybody truly state that, you know, this is the definite lifetime of a geothermal plant? Is it 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? If we look to countries who've gotten it right, countries like Iceland have had these power plants in for over 30 years. So, and it's estimated that in some cases, the lifetime of your geothermal power plant may be as much as 40, 50 years if you're lucky. And so having a project with such a long lifespan requires that even as you develop the land and you create access to your sites, that the community members are taken into account. That no one should be left worse off because of the development of a geothermal project. And while I would say, for me, coming from a small island and understanding the difficulties of having very high costs of electricity, I think an entire Caribbean nation stands to benefit. So that for me is my primary stakeholder. The benefits are, and we've heard them, but in terms of the cost of electricity, a geothermal project can impact your population across the board. And then going now into your community, I mean, your project should ensure that you have job creation, that, you know, that people are benefiting from geothermal energy, their lives are made better. And now, you know, as we look to a regional approach to diversifying our sector and really rethinking this age of disruption and thinking about the steps that we must take in this changing world and this energy sector that requires immediate change, I think one of the central points that we must remember is transforming lives. And geothermal energy is not just a project that the government does with development partners, but this is people-centric, and that should be factored in at every given point in your project.
Thank you, Charlene. Judith, I know Charlene posed a question to you on the ESIA in Dominica. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, if I may come in here, because Charlotte and I discussed that quite a lot over the past few weeks. The importance of involving the people whose lives will be affected by the development of the geothermal plants cannot be understated. And this aspect of the geothermal project in Dominica is being managed pretty well right now. As a matter of fact, this week they've been conducting testing at the drill site, testing of the wells, and they've run a very efficient public awareness campaign. They've met with the villagers and had town hall meetings. They have a community liaison officer, and they've been engaged with the villagers and Dominic as well, because the drill site is located right next to one of our installations, and they've handled that pretty well. They got there eventually at the beginning of the project when development of the present site was being done. It was not as effectively managed, and it created some discomfort. There was some public outcry. People had concerns, people had fears, but eventually through the management of it, both on the government side and the geothermal development company side, because the company itself was recently established and they did not have all of the officers or the departments that was that would have been required to deal with it. But eventually they got on board. They have published on their website the EIA study and several other documents and studies that relate to the community and how they propose to interact with the community as the project moves forward. So they have been managing that pretty effectively, but it wasn't always so. But they soon realized that, as Charlene has mentioned, for all the right reasons, that there has to be buy-in from the community. The area where the geothermal site, the geothermal plant will be sited, is right in the middle of what we call the Roseau Valley. And the Roseau Valley is also the most, it's like a tourism hub of the island. We pride ourselves on being the nature island of the Caribbean. We sell ourselves as a nature island resort. We promote hiking, we promote our lakes, our rivers, our waterfalls, our hike trails, our sulfur springs, and almost 90% of that is located in the Roseau Valley. And so the area where the project is being developed, there are people who have spas and other projects that they had fears about whether or not that would affect their livelihood. Does that mean that the spa, the sulfur springs will dry up and all of those things? And these things have to be dealt with prior or as the project develops. It has to be a crucial aspect because it has to be a shared vision. These people whose livelihoods depend on the natural surroundings and the spas and the waterfalls have to understand to what extent their livelihood is going to be affected by the development of the project. And that has been the discussion that has been ongoing. There have been, from time to time, there have been regular interactions with the community in terms of advising them of the development and the advantages as well as the likelihood of allaying their fears and addressing their concerns. So Charlene's point is very well placed. Development of the project is multi-sectoral. There are various sectors that have to weigh in on the project to help the whole project have better definition in terms of addressing the objectives, which at the end is to bring renewable, fairly priced energy that gives a fair return to the investor and as well as satisfies the government's development objectives. And the people who are the beneficiaries eventually of that energy and the people whose livelihoods are going to be affected by the construction of a geothermal plant right into their neighborhoods, they have a very valid reason to share their concerns and to be heard on it. And like I said, this is being very well managed at this point.
Actually, and I hope that other islands pursuing geothermal learn from Dominica and best practices. I just want to switch gears a little bit. So Dake Island, for you and the global audience, they're located in the Caribbean, which is a tropical area, and as such, very vulnerable to hurricanes. And as we've seen, the strength of hurricanes have been increasing. So in terms of vulnerability and resiliency, how has geothermal been considered in an effort to achieve a more resilient system? And how will that shape the resiliency of the island system moving forward? And I'd like to pitch the question to Judith.
Thanks, Diana. A very interesting question indeed. I think we need to look at the context of electricity and energy for developing countries, such as those of islands, and particularly those of the Caribbean. When we speak of energy resilience, it's important that we see it in its widest context. Resilience is really strengthening the capability of a system to withstand change. And I think when we speak of energy resilience, we have to see it really as a tool for promoting the larger resilience of the economies and of those societies. I think the passage of Hurricane Maria for Dominica really helped us to get a better appreciation of what energy resilience could look like going forward. A significant part of this island was the electricity network was destroyed. And as you would see in the rebuilding of Dominica, the issue of energy resilience and in particular geothermal has become very important for us. If we are able to build the resilience of our energy sector, it provides some positive ripple effects that can help to build the economies and the resilience of the other sectors that are dependent on energy, and almost every sector is dependent on energy. So it really has become a very important part of how we see the energy sector growing. Geothermal energy, because we are not dependent on importing any fuel, I think it provides some resilience in that aspect. But in its own right, geothermal allows some flexibility, some ancillary services of flexibility to the grid. And that is especially helpful when we think of integrating other renewable sources such as wind and solar. And so I think in planning ahead, the countries will need to take that into account. Of course, this will also necessitate that there may be changes to the entire energy and electricity infrastructure to make it more resilient, because it's important to have a comprehensive view of this. So you're not only trying to strengthen one part, but you want to ensure that your transmission and distribution are also strengthened. This will come at a cost to the countries, but the investment, if we look at the figures, it shows that if we are able to make some of those changes and make some of those investments, that it will pay off in the long run. Geothermal energy really, in terms of its being vulnerable to hurricanes, the belief is that it would be less so. So you would not have so much wind damage. But I just want to underscore the importance of looking at the whole energy system as a system, a complex system, and looking at all the parts and ensuring that when we look at the whole theme of resilience, we see it as really promoting the overall resilience of those islands.
Thank you, Judith. And Elise, being part of DOMLEC and hearing the geothermal development pre-Maria and post-Maria, how have things changed? And can you comment on the role of geothermal in Dominica in particular for resilience?
Yeah, thank you, Sana. I always fondly recall that in 2015, when we were in the middle of discussions with the second French consortium, as we refer to it, on the term sheet for the PPA agreement, we had very engaging discussions about catering for disruptive weather events in the power purchase agreement. And we were locked on the discussion, and it was a real sticking point. And then we had a break during the long vacation. And before we could reconvene in the later part of the year, we had a tropical storm Erica, which, although it was not a hurricane, but a tropical storm, it dumped about, I think it was over 12 inches of rain in a short space of time. created extensive flash flooding that created significant damage to the islands and to the electricity sector in specific communities. And it brought home in real and practical terms what was before an academic discussion in the PPA discussions about disruptive events to a 20-year contract. And usually these provisions really catered on the force majeure in the contract. Sorry, Sienna, if you just move, the lights will come back on. Yes. Yeah, sorry about that. And so the advent of Tropical Storm Erica brought us to appreciate that when we're looking at the project and the arrangement and negotiating the deal between the developer and the off-taker, the significance of disruptive weather events cannot be understated. Tropical Storm Erica struck in 2015, and thereafter, the project took on a different dimension in terms of the structure. And we also had Hurricane Maria. So what Tropical Storm Erica did not illustrate to us, Hurricane Maria brought home in even more real terms. Because whereas Tropical Storm Erica affected particular villages and communities, Hurricane Maria was totally devastating, and I believe upwards of 85 to 90% of the grid was entirely knocked out. And as Judith mentioned, when we look at resilience and what geothermal can bring in terms of resilience to the energy sector, we have to look at it as well from resilience, not only of the generating plant, because that is well established in terms of this, the science relating to the geothermal, the resilience of the geothermal plants and how well they can upkeep in terms of natural disasters and so on, but to look at the project as a whole, because the resilience of the grid is paramount to the success of the geothermal plants. Because even if the geothermal plant goes through a Category 5 storm and has minimal damage, but the entire grid is down and you have a resource and you're generating power which the off-taker cannot dispatch to its customers, then the resilience of your project is compromised. And that is something that Hurricane Maria and Tropical Storm Erica, because if you notice, the storms are becoming more and more frequent, they're more disruptive, there's a lot more water and precipitation with the storms, and there's a lot more significant damage arising out of this flood, this flash flooding which occurs, and the extent of the damage is widespread. So that the resilience of the grid is extremely crucial. Now, since Hurricane Maria, and very fortunately so, there have been a number of initiatives we've benefited from that has lent to the development of a more resilient network. The CCI themselves, which the project that they had in Dominica was the development of a sustainable resilient energy plan, which looked at not only identifying the generation mix, renewable energy generation mix that would provide the least cost benefit to the country and to customers, but also the resilience of it as well. And that study was recently completed in June, I believe, or there before that. And that was an initiative that provided a study which gave us insight into how the whole energy plan can be incorporated in such a manner that resiliency would be built into the system, not only on the generation side, but on the grid side. We also had, coming out after Maria, the assistance provided by the AFD, Agence Française Développement, which provided technical support to look at the resilience of the technical support to the government through a consultant. And one of the projects that they were engaged to perform was to look at the resilience of the transmission line that would take the geothermal energy from Loda to Foncolé. And so that aspect is also being reviewed with the assistance of the consultant provided by the AFD. After Maria as well, we as a private company were able to obtain funding from the CDB. And again, as a development bank, the CDB provided its support. And we have 3 consultancies on the project that as these projects are being implemented, as these consultancies are being implemented, the whole focus is geared towards resiliency. We had the engineering consultancy, which looked to ensuring that the structures that we were reconstructing met certain criteria that would guarantee that they were storm ready in terms of building stronger, using a different quality of poles. The guying method was looked at and so on. So we have an engineering consultancy and an engineering consultant who has been overseeing the reconstruction of the grid. We also had an organizational review consultancy that should be completed by the end of this year. And what it does was address capacity, looking at the organization and saying whether the capacity is in the company to deal with the transition to renewables, and whether there are gaps and how these gaps can be addressed. So addressing the people aspect of resilience, which is also an aspect of resilience, because you're moving into a new form of energy. You're moving from fossil fuel based to renewable. You have to have the capacity internally to address that. And that is part of the CDB loan project, as well as one of the consultancies. And the final consultancy we have under the project, which is expected to be completed this year as well, is the climate vulnerability risk assessment consultancy, which will look at the sector, look at our company and how it's been run and the whole layout, and provide recommendations on improving resiliency. So several initiatives have come up after Maria that would address that aspect of the whole energy project, the renewable energy project, so that on the generation side, we know that the resilience is well established, but on the grid side, we are looking also at ensuring that the network is better able to withstand these extreme weather events that we are more frequently being exposed to in the region.
Thanks, Elise. I mean, you raise an extremely important point that when pursuing geothermal, you can't draw a defined boundary around geothermal. You have to look at the entire grid, and not just the electrical part of the grid, but the resilient part, the community part. It's so multifaceted. And this panel as well, you're from Dominica, I'm in Dominica right now. Charlene and Judith are from St. Lucia, but they're working on regional bodies. And I think this panel is a great showcase of cooperation and sharing lessons learned among geothermal experts in the Caribbean. And I hope that camaraderie and the camaraderie between us shines through in this panel. But I want to learn a little bit more about the value that regional cooperation has unlocked. And Judith, will you be able to expand a bit more on that?
Thank you, Sienna. I think there is quite a lot that can be achieved through a collaborative approach for geothermal energy in the region. The Caribbean has taken a collaborative approach on energy for some time now, and I think geothermal energy is just another dimension of that cooperation that needs to be further developed and promoted. In the context of what has already been undertaken, I think Charlene nicely highlighted the good work that the Caribbean Development Bank has already done in terms of their GeoSmart, helping to assist with one of the major challenges for geothermal development in the region, which has been the financing. So I think we already have some clear successes. A number of the other partners who have worked with geothermal have also been able to work in a number of countries. And if we look closely, we will notice that each country has a different story, but the stories are similar. So everyone has taken a slightly different approach to geothermal, but the challenges are largely the same. The characteristics of the countries are largely the same. And so that presents a good opportunity for us to strategize and to collaborate to see how we can address those challenges, taking advantage of economies of scale. So for instance, if we look at the challenge of policy, it has already been highlighted that, the inadequacies of laws that support geothermal and the whole enabling environment when it comes to policy is a major challenge for the region. Given that there are so many similarities in terms of the law, in terms of the structure of government, there is an opportunity for a model to be developed within the Caribbean that can be shared and modified as best suits the needs of the particular country. When we look at the whole challenge of capacity building, the capacity on each island for geothermal or even for energy is not significant. Those public offices that address energy, they are actually largely not adequate, although we have some very good workers in there who are doing some phenomenal work. But in terms of the number of hands, so to speak, there should really be some kind of augmentation of that. And so it presents an opportunity for us to share best practices, to share our technical experience and our expertise, to learn from each other. Some of the mistakes that we have experienced on any one island can easily happen on another island when it comes to, for instance, investments and investors who are not particularly the types of investors that we are looking for, and being able to recognize that and being able to put in the necessary safeguards. This is a good opportunity for us to share our experiences and to collaborate on that. In terms of capacity, again, if you're looking for a program that is specifically designed for the region, in terms of economies of scale, it makes much more sense to have a group approach if you're having a training or some workshop, and so that reduces the cost. And we have had some experience in that already. In terms of sharing, in terms of other opportunities for building the capacity of even the policymakers and having this kind of interaction at the high level, it is also a very important component, because at the end of the day, it is the policymakers, most of the time the ministers, who make the big decisions concerning geothermal, and they may not be exactly where we want them to be in terms of their knowledge and understanding of geothermal energy. And so adopting an approach which allows for dialogue amongst the policymakers, this is not something new. It's something that has been done in various parts of the world. For instance, in the Eastern African region, having this, ministerial meeting, this would really support the efforts for geothermal in the region. So we definitely see some opportunity there. I think the OECS is well placed to support that, but we also have the efforts of CCRI and CARICOM that can help bring together a joint coordinated effort for geothermal energy. And we have the existence of a functioning geothermal plant in the region, that of Guadeloupe. And I know that the Regional Council of Guadeloupe recently got the approval for a project that really seeks to support geothermal energy and to promote collaboration through the establishment of a regional center of excellence for geothermal, which will allow some of the hands-on training without our people having to move too far. So I really think that there's a good opportunity. And again, going back to this whole issue of geothermal energy being a means to promoting energy independence as well as energy interdependence. And I think that the OECS is quite keen on supporting this. We are looking to establish a geothermal development mechanism to support this, both at the technical level and at the political level. Last December, we had some very good discussions through the support of some partners that we had, like the IGA and IRENA, where we were able to bring together for the first time a very large grouping that included the utilities, the public agencies dealing with geothermal, the regulators, academia, again, drawing on all the skills that currently exist so that we can understand where each island is going, and we can collectively support each other in our national efforts, which ultimately will redound to the benefit of the whole region.
Thank you so much, Judith. That's amazing to hear that the regional collaboration is going to be leveling up very soon. So my last question before I get to the Q&A, and if you have any more questions from the audience, please submit them through the Q&A section. My last question is for Charlene, and it was mentioned before that there's some pools in the Caribbean that use the theme from the underground activity for funk and other direct youth and even agriculture and greenhouses. Charlene, can you speak to how the direct youth theme can enhance the economy and not just through the electricity sector? You're on mute, sorry.
Thanks, Yana. If you could just also put up my slides on screen.
Sure, one sec.
And while you do that, I just wanted to chime in. You know, Judith spoke about the regional cooperation, and I'm very pleased to see that our regional bodies are coming together and assisting our member states in meeting their energy targets. And geothermal is obviously not left behind. And as Judith mentioned, there are organizations such as CCRE, and for those joining us from all around the world who may be wondering what CCRE stands for, CCRE is the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, and it is the implementation hub in the Caribbean region for sustainable energy. And the CCRE works through also its thematic hubs, and the thematic hub for geothermal is the OECS. So this is testimony of us forming the right strategic partnerships to assist our member states to develop their geothermal resource and to meet their targets. So you asked Sienna on, you know, the alternatives. So far the Caribbean region has focused its efforts on electricity generation where geothermal energy is concerned. But this does not mean that this is the only opportunity for developing that resource. And a number of countries in the rest of the world, in other parts of the world, have proven that geothermal energy is not only useful for electricity generation, but there is value added through the direct use of geothermal energy. And I think in the Caribbean, in the past, we have tended to be the receiver of proven and mature technologies, methods, and strategies. And I am challenging us as Caribbean people to get on board, not when it's been proven in every other part of the world. And perhaps this is not a Caribbean thing, but as small islands, we tend to prioritize, rightfully so. But where geothermal is concerned, I challenge island states to get ahead of the program. I might even argue that Iceland, while it may be seen as part of Europe, Iceland is in fact an island, and they have been able to make geothermal work for them, not only for electricity generation, but for their energy needs in general. And so it is important, and you would see that screen on screen, the slide on screen, looking at new opportunities. On one hand, we have value added through direct use of geothermal energy. So that is, and that can be done in various ways. And while I understand that our priority is at this point geothermal electricity generation, especially in cases where islands are yet to confirm the commercial viability of the resource. But I believe the Caribbean is well poised to begin investigating and carrying out further exploration and research on the use of direct use. And that can be looked at as cogeneration. So it may not be necessarily drilling dedicated wells simply for the direct use of that heat or that resource, but it may very well be tied in to projects that are already on the way. Some islands have gone the route of drilling slim wells, or will go the route of drilling slim wells. And the question remains, will these slim wells, in the event that the resource is commercially viable, will these slim wells be simply covered up? Will they be used? Is there any value we can get out of them? You also have the case where you may decide to do a cascade development. So while that fluid is brought to the surface and heat is extracted to drive your turbines, you now have a loop, making it renewable. So that fluid now is re-injected. But before it is re-injected, you still have that fluid at high temperatures. Is there any value that can be added? Is there any value that we can get out of that? And I want to tie it again to looking at this as being people-centric and looking at geothermal as being something that should benefit our people. So if you can just go to the next slide. Okay, so when I speak of direct utilization and I think of the Caribbean region and our islands in the Caribbean, I think of greenhouses, agro-processing, recreational use, fish farming. And these are really not novel ideas. For centuries, geothermal energy has been used directly, especially for recreational use. Iceland, I mean, I think everybody's heard of the Blue Lagoon. People travel to Iceland to visit the Blue Lagoon. And it's always funny when the guys at that power plant give the account of some of the reaction that they get from the visiting tourists. And they believe that, you know, why was that power plant built near this lagoon? It really spoils the natural beauty, when really the lagoon is there as a result of the power plant. So this is the fluid that is brought to the surface for electricity generation, now being used as a serious revenue generator. And that power plant, you know, that consortium, power plant and spa facility, when you think of the return on investment, only because of the Blue Lagoon and the spa facilities, it's really amazing. And Kenya has followed suit. There are other islands, other countries in the world that have used geothermal fluids for recreational use. And Iceland, again, I would have to mention as a leader where fish farming is concerned, using geothermal fluids to get the right temperature. Agro-processing, I will pick out Kenya as a leader, as Kenya has the largest geothermal greenhouse in the world, producing cut flower, and with Europe as their major market. And so the Caribbean, I believe, is no different, and we must find what works for us in our context. And so a deep dive was done by Deloitte on behalf of the US State Department of Energy, and St. Lucia was the selected island for direct utilization. And that deep dive resulted in a few suggestions. Of course, St. Lucia is poised and the OECS is poised for further exploring these ideas, coming up with concrete information. But as it stands, even preliminary numbers have been run, and using historical data from St. Lucia, considering overnight stays, the number of overnight stays recorded for the island, a preliminary study, an economic study, reveals that a spa treatment using geothermal fluid for direct utilization is economically viable. And so that's assuming an investment of roughly 15 to 20 million US dollars, with 500 visitors per day to the facility. Also of importance as a possibility for the Caribbean region is the drying of crops. And I want to single out the sargassum seaweed, as this continues to plague many of our islands because of the unsavory odor that it brings, affecting therefore not only our locals, but also our tourism product, and our beaches are very important to us. And from 2014, the Caribbean, and maybe some islands even before that, but St. Lucia from 2014, has been dealing with the effects of sargassum. There is a businessman on island that has formed a business where he dries sargassum and uses it and resells it. And so right now it's something that he does using solar energy. He puts it out to dry. And there is a possibility of using geothermal heat to dry sargassum and other crops. Some including cocoa, as St. Lucia and other islands in the Caribbean produce cocoa and chocolate. And so that is another area that we can look at, the agricultural sector. And here I would like to insert the nexus between food security and energy. And I really want to advocate that we not look at geothermal in isolation at all, but that it's extremely important for us to connect the dots with geothermal, what it brings to us as a people, what it brings to our region, and how we can maximize the benefits from geothermal energy. And if we could go to the next slide. So I already spoke about the sargassum, and in case my words did not have an impact, I hope that this photo has an impact. I personally detest going to the beach and having to interact with that seaweed. And so I definitely would support geothermal being used to get another product out of the seaweed. Next slide, please. Spoke of cocoa drying. Again, St. Lucia, this is something that definitely is viable for St. Lucia. Of course, more numbers have to be run, but as a preliminary idea, I believe it's something we should take and run with. And in case you've never visited or seen the Blue Lagoon in Iceland, I hope that inspires you to visit. And in addition, those of us who work in geothermal, that it inspires you to look at developing spas across the Caribbean and in your home countries where possible. So apart from direct use, I also want to encourage us in the region to look at alternative pathways. We've had that traditional, that conventional view of drilling a few wells and having a steam collector and then building a power plant. I want to draw on the experience of Kenya, and they were the first country in the world to make use of what we call temporary geothermal wellheads. So as each well is drilled, a small modular unit is installed, and that unit produces electricity. This was done with a view of eliminating this missed opportunity while Kenya continued to develop their geothermal fields. And so the intention was to place a wellhead unit on each well while you continue to develop your geothermal field. And once all your wells were drilled, then you would now remove these wellhead units. But in some cases, these wellhead units have very well become part of the entire energy landscape, the electricity generation landscape, and seem to be heading to being more permanent fixtures. And so I just want to draw on that. I think the Caribbean should also look at alternative pathways as it develops geothermal energy. And if you could just click the screen, Sienna. So for this geothermal field in Kenya, the total capacity from only wellhead units is 83.5 megawatts. And you see that the size of these modular units, 2.4 megawatts, 3.2, and 5 megawatt units.
Thanks, Charlene. So we have about 10 minutes left, or 9 minutes actually. So I'll go to the Q&A that the audience has submitted, and I'll choose questions based on how frequently they were voted up with a thumbs up. So the first question is, what are the characteristics an island needs to be a candidate for the implementation of geothermal power? And what makes geothermal competitive at an island level? I think the first one is pretty easy. What makes a candidate, and that is an underground resource, but I would hand it over to anyone who wants to tackle that question in more detail.
Well, I think, Sienna, if I can just jump in, just to say that geothermal energy really has some unique qualities, and there are additional benefits, but I think there are some requirements, so to speak. If there is strong political will, if you have the initial investment, because that is also going to be very important to sustain it. You need the technical capacity and the right institutional support for it to be successful. You need a conducive environment in terms of your policy and your legal requirements. And I think these working together, ensuring that you have the right environmental and social safeguards, and ensuring that you have the participation of the communities in supporting geothermal, will all lead to a successful project.
Yep, definitely. Is there anything to add from any other panelists? Okay, I hope that answers your question, Leonardo. Okay, so next question. Given that geothermal plants can provide continuous power, unlike solar or wind, do small islands still consider a diversified mix? Are there any threats to geothermal when it comes to climate change?
Okay, maybe I can chime in on that. I can refer to the case of St. Lucia. St. Lucia did conduct an IRP, an integrated resource plan, where it looked at a mix of technologies. And one may ask, okay, why wouldn't St. Lucia choose to single-handedly produce electricity from geothermal? The truth is there are a number of factors that must be looked at. And in that IRP, one of the important things for the island was identifying a mix of technologies that would provide the least cost option. We speak of climate change, and while countries like St. Lucia and the rest of the Caribbean have committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the truth of our reality is that we produce 0.00, I'll repeat another 0.15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so our primary driver for diversifying our sector may not necessarily be simply to meet our international targets. For us, the economics is of utmost importance as we diversify our sectors, and having a mix of technologies proves to be the right ingredient or the right remedy for having a least cost. And it also allows us to involve the private sector, to involve the wider community and the wider population. So distributed solar is something that is looked at so that the population can participate in that transition. I also think in terms of resilience, having all your eggs in one basket, in one geothermal basket, may not give you that level of resilience that we speak of. And he did mention climate change. I would go a little further, and it's perhaps an elephant in the room where geothermal is concerned, is something that I believe we avoid speaking about. But while we speak of hurricanes, we never really tackle the issue of seismic disasters, which may very well put down an entire geothermal plant. I believe it's less risky than the Category 5 hurricanes that seem to have become the norm for the Caribbean region. But I believe it's in our island's best interest to look at a mix of technologies. And I believe Judith touched on that in one of her interventions, where she mentioned the fact that what geothermal actually does is it allows you now to have, because it provides base load, it precisely allows you to have a certain amount of wind and solar that are intermittent on the grid.
Charlene. We have 3 more minutes for some closing comments. Elise, would
Anna, you're not very clear. Could you just repeat? Are you asking
sorry.
for closing comments?
Sorry, my internet was a little unstable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we have 3 more minutes, so I would like to open it to closing comments.
Yes.
So we'll go with Elise, then
Okay.
Judith, then Charlene again.
And Charlene. Yeah. To close, I just would want to reiterate that geothermal development, we've been a while at it, and it poses such a great opportunity for transforming the energy sector in our small island states, that we're engaged with it now more than we've ever been before. And I think we need to continue keeping at it. I think the key to it is to pull on our successes, to collaborate regionally, to identify the opportunities that have been realized by those of us who've gone further than we've ever done so before, and to develop, I really think that the potential for really getting this thing eventually to bear fruits is to take it from the regional perspective. Let us harmonize our efforts, both in terms of capacity building, identifying the requisite financing, and coming up with a structure, a project structure or a project model, both from the financing and technical side, that would secure our ability to actually implement these projects successfully. But I really think the regional approach is the key to eventually achieving that success.
I want to say that I think geothermal energy is more than a renewable energy. It really is a national development effort, and it calls for collaboration at the national and international level. And we want to thank our partners, and we look forward to the success on other islands.
Charlene?
Yes, I again want to reiterate the potential of geothermal to transform lives in our Caribbean island. And I again appeal to our member states, fellow islanders, as you think of geothermal, think outside of the box, and let us also apply our own research and development to trying to get the very best value out of our resource.
Thank you everyone for participating in the very informative session. I hope all attendees learned a lot about the opportunities and challenges of geothermal in the Caribbean. And thank you everyone. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to all.